So new polling in New York's 10th district shows an awfully close race in this newly drawn open seat. Danny Goldman, who was an MSNBC pundit, who was also one of the attorneys leading the first Trump impeachment, is leading the field at 22%. Yulin New, local state legislator, at 17% in second place. Mondaire Jones, congressman from north of the city, who's now running in the city, at 13%, and Carlina Rivera, city councilwoman, also at 13%. So a very close race, which was rocked by a rather shocking endorsement recently by the New York Times when they jumped in to back Dan Goldman. The first thing that was so shocking about this is the New York Times, Briahna, almost never. They practically have a rule against endorsing somebody who is a self-funder. And this Dan Goldman gave his campaign $1 million very recently, and is I'm sure he will give more down the stretch. He is the heir to the Levi Strauss fortune. He's personally said to be worth something like $250 million, but that's before he's inherited this massive fortune that'll come his way next. And so they didn't. If they ever do endorse a self-funder, they'll do a lot of self-flagellation along the way and say that how sad they are, but they have no choice to endorse this self-funder. They didn't even remotely do that this time. The only clue they gave to that was they said both Goldman and Mondaire Jones will have a lot of work to do in their first term to show the kind of working class areas of the district that they understand their concerns. So basically, they want to give Dan Goldman a trial period of 2 years to see if he can start to identify with the working class people in the district. But they didn't really explain why he would. He's so out of touch with the working class people in the district. And they lump
Mondaire Jones in there, drawing some equivalence between their background. I mean, I don't know a ton about Mondaire Jones's background. I confess that I did go to law school with him, but my understanding was that he does not come from an especially affluent background, and I feel like I've heard him speak before about some economic struggles growing up that obviously he was able to, kind of volley out of with, through his educational attainment.
Yeah, he was raised by a single mom who cleaned houses in the district that he currently, fairly wealthy district that he currently represents. So he understands working class struggle, and so the way that they kind of shoehorned them together was pretty disingenuous, because what they're saying is that Mondaire Jones has never lived in that district, because he got pushed out of his own district by Sean Patrick Maloney and wound up running in this one. So he just physically, literally hasn't been in these communities, whereas Dan Goldman does live there, but just kind of looks out at his window from the back seat of his chauffeured sedan. What they didn't mention is that the Goldman family and the Sulzberger family are very close. Then his mother and Kathy Sulzberger served together on the board of Sidwell Friends back when he went to Sidwell Friends, which, as you know, is the super elite kind of private school in Washington, D.C. He was a year ahead of this guy, Dave Perpich, who is the son of that mom, who is now a big shot at the New York Times, a major executive over there, and who was in the running to actually be the publisher of the New York Times. Didn't get that position. So we don't know whether what role the Sulzberger family had in this, but the Sulzberger family oversees, the editorial board reports directly to the Sulzberger family. And so when you look at this field of candidates and then you see that they chose Dan Goldman out of all of these candidates, like, wow, they're just trying to prove Trump right, it seems like.
Yeah, it's a fascinating race and a fascinating district. That was my previous district when I live in Washington, D.C., and it stretches up the side of Manhattan. So there's parts of it in the north of the city that are more Harlem, Morningside Heights-ish, and more diverse and lower income, but it goes right down the Upper West Side and right down into the West Village. And so there is an interesting dynamic here where there's always this rhetoric about whether a candidate knows the district and is able to connect with the district, with a presumption that the majority of people in any district in the country are going to be more working class. But this is one of those places where I don't know that I feel that same need for them to have those kind of like John Fetterman bona fides when we're talking about representing perhaps one of the most affluent parts of the country and the city there is. Also, New York has this interesting dynamic where people live in lots of different parts of Manhattan. And I don't know that someone who lived in Midtown East and then moved to the West Village or the Upper West Side doesn't know anything about the Upper West Side because they were living, across a random borderline, on the other side of Central Park, as it were. So I'm interested to see whether or not that kind of a distinction makes a difference to the voters in the district, especially given that everyone's kind of aware of this weird musical chairs that's happened because of the redistricting in the state.
Yeah, and I think Mondaire Jones really needed this endorsement. Like if he had gotten it, and what I had heard is that he was, and you can read the endorsement and see that it was that the board it was very close between the two. We don't know how ultimately the thumb went on the scale how ultimately Goldman got it over Jones. If Jones had gotten it, I think he'd be in serious contention. Without it, he's really struggling, and that leaves I think Yulin Liu in the best position to beat Goldman here, because she has this huge base of support in Chinatown, both in where is it Queens or Brooklyn and Manhattan. The city better than me, but there's two major Chinatowns. Mm-hmm. She represents them both in the state legislature and is a very popular official there. Has an extraordinary volunteer operation, and so the question is, was Emerson College able to effectively poll Chinatown? Or is she going to be able to pull more support out of there? Plus, she also has a lot of the kind of DSA backing, progressive, a lot of progressive, kind of organizations in the city are behind her as well. So that combined coalition might be enough to surprise the pollsters on election day in a very difficult to poll time, because it's next week. All of Dan Goldman's voters, his base will all be in the Hamptons or vacationing somewhere else. And so unless he can get them to file their absentee ballots, it's going to be tough. Whereas I think a lot of the working class voters, will actually be in the city to vote. But it's going to be low turnout either way. The poll was surprisingly low for Carlina Rivera. She's a fairly popular, city councilwoman with a big base of support there. And maybe they haven't effectively polled her base either. I think so. It's still, I think, very, very much up for grabs. But the New York Times endorsement is massive in these kinds of races, and for them to come down with, for Dan Goldman it's a rather extraordinary call on their part, and really risks their credibility in a lot what they have left. Yeah.
How much these endorsements do matter, given that it seems, at least in the presidential endorsement context, whoever the New York Times picks absolutely does not become president of the United States, or the party's primary winner. They very famously, of course, I guess, co-endorsed Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar in 2019, and very shortly after, I think both women's fates were kind of sealed in the broader general election context. After it was around the time that Warren was having a really great summer, and that endorsement didn't seem to boost her in any real way. But you're saying it's different with these local contests. People really pay attention to the New York Times endorsement.
Right, because a lot of people don't have, they don't have intimate knowledge of all of these different candidates, and so for a lot of them, they'll just, for a local race, they'll just look and say, oh, this is the Times, like, this person must be fine. I think, like, Alessandra Biaggi's challenge to Sean Patrick Maloney, they also endorsed Maloney, which was a rather bizarre move on their part. And I think for Biaggi, that was kind of her chance, because they're like, if you're going to find voters who are persuaded by a New York Times endorsement, it's going to be these primary voters in Manhattan and north of the city who read the New York Times. The Warren case is an interesting one. If you remember, like, her polling really started to plummet among Democratic primary voters right after the New York Times ran this huge kind of analysis of how they, according to them, that she was unelectable in a general election. And that really kind of stuck to her. And for these kind of partisan voters who consider themselves to be pundits and wanted the most electable candidate, to have the New York Times tell them, with their needles, that she can't win, they're like, all right, well, who else you got? And you started seeing people move away from her. So that's not the endorsement playing a role, but it is the New York Times effect playing out among these readers who really do see the New York Times as kind of a North Star for them.
Well, I think your point about the support in the Chinatowns across the country, I think, is a good one as well, as a group that potentially is not as beholden to the New York Times endorsement. I do remember when we were covering AOC's race back in 2018, her first race, talking about Joe Crowley having such a bankhead, in part because he had very good relationships with, I believe it was Queens's Chinatown and the Chinese American community there, and that had been kind of the root of his power, his congressional power, for a really long time. So we'll see. Obviously, AOC was able to get turnout in other kinds of areas. The Interceptors did a great job covering how it was actually these kind of gentrified mixed race areas in her district that came out and had a lot of door knocking campaigns that was able to overcome that effect. But I do think it's very interesting to track some of these populations that aren't as closely followed in the area. Of course, we will continue to follow this story and more and give you more Rising after this.